Could Bigfoot be a fallen angel? Well, one of the things that really isn't talked a lot about Bigfoot, but I ask often, is why is Bigfoot restricted from coming in contact with us?
What if the most credible Bigfoot investigator alive isn't a conspiracy theorist? He's a former cop. David Paulides spent decades applying real forensic methodology to one of history's most mocked mysteries, and what he uncovered has rattled witnesses, unsettled researchers, and put him at permanent odds with the scientific establishment across North America.
So we found nuclear DNA, but that even added more to the mystery because...
Unknown.
Unknown.
I knew it. I knew you would say that. That's been our hypothesis from day one, that when you do get nuclear DNA, there'll be nothing in the gen bank.
DNA that nobody can cleanly explain. Footprints that challenge biomechanics. Sounds that trained linguists are calling structured language. A government paper trail that raises questions nobody in uniform wants to answer on the record. Is this proof or the world's most elaborate, most disciplined rabbit hole? We are going in all the way, and we promise you this one does not end cleanly. The man who blew up the Bigfoot myth. Before we get into the unsettling details, let's talk about why David Paulides matters in the first place, because this is not your average tinfoil hat-wearing, blurry photo-posting Bigfoot guy. Not even close. Paulides walked into the Bigfoot conversation with something almost nobody in this space ever brings: actual credentials. We're talking about a trained detective, a man who spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, worked on SWAT teams, cracked street crimes, and interrogated real criminals for a living. He knows how to spot a lie. He knows what credible testimony looks like versus someone who is performing for an audience. He knows how evidence is supposed to be gathered, documented, and tested. And when that guy looks you dead in the face and tells you Bigfoot might be real and that it might be part human, well, suddenly it doesn't feel quite so easy to laugh off anymore. What makes his approach completely different from every other Bigfoot researcher out there is that he didn't start from belief. He started from skepticism. When he was approached to investigate sightings at the Hoopa Reservation in Northern California, he brought no agenda and no wishful thinking, just the cold, methodical instincts of a homicide detective who had spent years being lied to by people far more practiced at it than any Bigfoot witness. He showed up with a notepad, a forensic artist, and a commitment to following the evidence wherever it led. And the evidence? It led somewhere that changed his life forever. He wrote his findings into a book, The Hoopa Project, in 2008, and it was named Bigfoot Book of the Year. That was just the beginning. He followed it up with Tribal Bigfoot, then launched the Missing 411 series, a body of work documenting clusters of bizarre, unsettling disappearances in United States national parks, cases where the circumstances were so strange and so inconsistent with conventional search and rescue logic that they attracted a following of hundreds of thousands of people who had never given a single thought to Bigfoot in their lives. That series became its own cultural phenomenon. Documentaries, podcasts, a community of researchers. People who will tell you completely seriously that after reading it, they cannot look at a national park the same way again. Most recently, Paulides released a feature-length film called American Sasquatch, Man, Myth, or Monster in December 2025, bringing together decades of fieldwork, forensic analysis, and witness testimony into one production. The man has built an entire empire around this mystery, and the deeper you go into his catalog, the harder it becomes to dismiss it as the work of someone chasing fame or selling a fantasy. He is too careful for that, too precise. So where did this all actually start? And why did a Native American reservation in the mountains of Northern California become the ground zero for one of the most explosive investigations in modern folklore? The Hoopa Valley, where it all started. Here's how this whole thing begins, and pay attention, because the details matter. David Paulides gets hired, or rather persuaded, to take his detective skills to the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California. The Hoopa tribe had been living alongside these creatures for generations, possibly centuries. They didn't call them Bigfoot. They called them the Forest People. And unlike the sensationalized tabloid version of a screaming, unknowable ape beast, the Hoopa described something far more complicated and, in a way, far more unsettling. Beings that appeared to have social structures. Families. Established territories with what witnesses described as unspoken rules about where each side stayed and what each side was permitted to do. Tribal elders told Paulides about feeding rituals, the practice of leaving food at the edge of the forest, not as an offering to a god or a spirit, but almost as an unneighborly gesture. Something closer to leaving a dish on a porch for something that might recognize it and appreciate it. About the creatures watching from the tree line, never crossing certain boundaries, as if they understood not just the physical geography of the land, but the social contract that came with it. These weren't spooky stories told around a campfire for entertainment. These were accounts passed down through generations with the weight of lived memory, consistent testimonies from people who had no reason to fabricate them and no Instagram following to gain from going public. What struck Paulides, the detective in him, was the consistency. Across multiple witnesses of different ages, different backgrounds, different positions within the tribe, the core picture held together. The details that matched weren't the dramatic ones. They were the quiet, specific, almost mundane ones. The kind of detail that, in a criminal investigation, tells you someone is recalling something real, rather than constructing something convincing. And then came the sketches, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Paulides brought in Harvey Pratt, an FBI-trained forensic artist with decades of experience sketching criminal suspects from eyewitness descriptions. This man had drawn killers, armed robbers, and terrorists. He had sat with traumatized survivors in the hours after violence and pulled faces out of their memories with the kind of precision that holds up in a courtroom. So Paulides sent him in to sit with Hoopa witnesses and do exactly the same thing. No leading questions, no reference images, just the same structured interview process he would use for any other criminal composite. The results were striking. The faces that came out of those sessions did not look like an ape. They didn't look like a bear or a gorilla or anything that belongs in a zoo or a wildlife documentary. According to multiple witnesses who reviewed the sketches, they looked disturbingly, unexpectedly human. High cheekbones, expressive, set-back eyes. A facial structure that, if it appeared at a window at night, you might briefly mistake for a person before realizing the proportions were not quite right. Now, it is worth being precise here. Forensic sketches are only as accurate as the witnesses behind them, and looking more human than expected is not the same as scientific proof of anything. But the value of what Pratt produced is in the consistency. Multiple witnesses, independent sessions, remarkably similar outputs. Harvey Pratt himself, a man who had spent his entire career drawing human faces, looked at Paulides after those first sessions and said, point blank, "Dave, this isn't anything like we've always heard." Coming from a forensic expert who had seen everything and was not in the business of dramatizing his reactions. That statement raises questions that nobody in official science has been willing to sit down and seriously answer. But if the faces looked human, what was the science actually saying? Because somebody eventually had to run the DNA. The DNA that broke science. Let's talk about the study that the scientific establishment has, at the very least, been in no hurry to revisit. In 2013, a paper emerged claiming to have successfully sequenced genetic material attributed to Bigfoot from 111 samples collected across North America, hair, tissue, blood, gathered from sites spread across multiple states and provinces over several years. The lead scientist was Dr. Melba Ketchum, a credentialed geneticist with a background in veterinary DNA diagnostics, and Paulides has publicly confirmed that his organization, the North American Bigfoot Search, was instrumental in helping assemble and submit many of those samples. This was not a rush job. The study took 5 years from sample collection to publication, 5 years of lab work, analysis, and attempts to get it in front of peer reviewers. Here's what the DNA reportedly showed. The mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, came back as fully human, not ape-adjacent, not primate-adjacent. Human tracing back to female lineages approximately 12,000 to 15,000 years old, with genetic signatures potentially pointing toward the Middle East. To be clear about what that would mean if accurate, these creatures, whatever they are, had human women somewhere in their ancestry. That is not a fringe interpretation of the data. That is what the data, as Ketchum's team read it, directly stated. But the nuclear DNA, the contribution from the paternal side, reportedly matched nothing. Not a gorilla, not a chimpanzee, not any known primate in any existing genetic reference database on the planet. It was, by Ketchum's account, entirely unclassified. Something that has no name and no entry in any catalog of known life on Earth. Her interpretation, and it is important to keep calling it her interpretation, was that these creatures are hybrids, the biological offspring of human mothers and an unknown, unidentified, non-human species on the father's side, not animals in any conventional sense. Something without a category. Now, here is where the story gets complicated in a way that matters, because a channel that flattens the nuance to make things sound more dramatic is one you should stop trusting immediately. The mainstream scientific community did not respond to this study with the silence of institutions hiding something. They responded with specific technical objections. Geneticists who examined the paper argued that the presence of human mitochondrial DNA in the samples was consistent with one far simpler explanation: contamination. Human DNA is everywhere. It is on every surface, on every collection tool, on every researcher's hands. Without sterile controls rigorous enough to rule out contact contamination at every stage, detecting human DNA in a sample tells you almost nothing about where that sample came from. Critics also pointed to the peer review pathway the study eventually took. It was published in a journal called De Novo, a publication that Ketchum's team had a notable hand in establishing, which is not how independent peer review is supposed to work. The process of having your own work reviewed in a journal you helped create is, by scientific community standards, not peer review. It is something that looks like peer review from a distance. And major journals, including Nature, passed on the paper without the dramatic door slam that Paulides supporters have described. The scientific community's position was not that somebody was suppressing a dangerous truth. It was that the methodology did not hold up to the scrutiny required to make that kind of claim. Does that mean the results are definitively wrong? Not necessarily, and this is the honest answer. It means they have never been independently replicated under conditions rigorous enough to compel mainstream science to engage. Those are two different things, and the difference matters. Paulides and those in his corner argue the dismissal was intellectual cowardice dressed up as methodology. Critics argue the burden of proof for a claim this extraordinary has simply never been met. Both sides have been saying the same things to each other for over a decade. And in the meantime, the physical evidence sits in casts and crates and field notes, waiting for someone to finally do something definitive with it. About those footprints, though. Because some things leave marks in the ground that are genuinely hard to account for. The early life of David Paulides, the cop nobody expected. Before he became the name sitting at the center of one of America's most polarizing mysteries, David Paulides was just a kid from Columbia Falls, Montana. A small town, the kind where everyone knows you, the nearest city feels far away, and the mountains are always watching. That kind of place shapes you. It either makes you uneasy in the wild or completely at home in it. For Paulides, it was the second. Somewhere in those early years, a quiet curiosity took hold, and it never really let go. He went on to study at the University of San Francisco, a school known for discipline and critical thinking, not exactly a launch pad for the unexplained. By 1977, he was in law enforcement, starting in Fremont, before moving to the San Jose Police Department in 1980. And this wasn't a casual role. He worked patrol, SWAT, street crimes, and as a detective. Real work, high-pressure situations, the kind that forces you to trust evidence, instincts, and nothing in between. Then came 1996, and everything shifted. While working as a court liaison, he was charged with a misdemeanor tied to allegedly soliciting for a charity using department letterhead. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. His career in law enforcement ended there. From the outside, that could have been the final chapter. He moved into tech, took on executive roles, and disappeared from public attention. But something pulled him back, something tied to the wilderness he grew up around. First, it was Bigfoot. Then it expanded into the missing 411 cases, unexplained disappearances in national parks backed by real reports, real locations, and patterns that were hard to ignore. That work brought him into a different spotlight. Not as a storyteller, but as an investigator asking uncomfortable questions. The kid from Montana became a cop. The cop became a researcher. And somehow, the deeper he went, the more it felt like the wilderness wasn't done with him yet. Which brings us to the evidence you can actually see. Because some things don't just get reported. They leave tracks behind. Footprints that should not exist. This is the section that makes certain scientists uncomfortable, even the cautious and skeptical ones, because eyewitness testimony you can dismiss. DNA methodology. You can argue about for decades, but physical track casts sitting on a shelf in a laboratory, those require a different kind of engagement. Paulides and the researchers working alongside him have collected and analyzed hundreds of track casts from across North America, spanning multiple decades and multiple ecosystems, from the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest to the snowfields of the Northern Rockies. And some of what they have documented is, at minimum, genuinely difficult to explain using the standard toolkit of wildlife biology. First, dermal ridges. Just like fingerprints, dermal ridges are the fine friction skin patterns covering the soles of human and primate feet. They are anatomically specific, difficult to replicate convincingly in a fake, and unique to individuals. Some Bigfoot track casts reportedly show these ridges, present and consistent across the surface of the impression, in detail that would require either a real biological foot or an extraordinarily sophisticated fabrication. When Jimmy Chilcutt, a fingerprint specialist with the Conroe Police Department in Texas, examined a selection of these casts, he concluded that the ridge patterns were not only present, but showed characteristics he had not seen in any known primate. Chilcutt went in as a skeptic and came out saying the casts were not hoaxed. That does not make them proof of anything supernatural, but it does make them worth taking seriously. Second, the mid-tarsal break. Human feet are biomechanically rigid through the arch. We push off with a locked midfoot in a way that is distinctly different from great apes, which have a flexible midfoot suited for grasping branches and navigating arboreal terrain. Some of the tracks Paulides has documented appear to show a midfoot flexibility that falls somewhere between the two, a dynamic gait signature that is not consistent with a human wearing a foam suit and not consistent with any known North American Wildlife. Biomechanics researcher Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University, a tenured academic who has staked professional credibility on this subject, has analyzed many of these casts and argues that the locomotion pattern they suggest is not replicable through known hoaxing methods. Not everyone in his field agrees, but Meldrum is not a crank. He is a peer-reviewed scientist with a real academic position, and his involvement alone changes the texture of this conversation. Third, and this is where the accounts become harder to verify, tracks that some field researchers describe as appearing mid-stride in open ground with no clear approach trail leading in and no exit trail leading out. Paulides has documented these reports at multiple sites, and they are among the most provocative claims in his body of work. It is critical to be honest here. This particular detail rests almost entirely on anecdotal field accounts and has not been independently verified under controlled conditions. Skeptics offer straightforward explanations. Differential melting of snow can erase partial trails and create exactly this appearance, especially in changing weather. Wind-blown terrain leaves similar ambiguities. Paulides argues that in many of the documented cases, the environmental conditions make these explanations insufficient. The argument has not been resolved, and it is unlikely to be resolved through field reports alone. But here is what cuts through all of it. Some of these creatures appear, according to multiple researchers across multiple decades and locations, to communicate with each other. And somebody, decades ago, recorded something that trained language specialists cannot fully account for. They've been talking this whole time. The Sierra Nevada mountains. Early 1970s. A remote, high-altitude campsite where a small group of researchers thought they were just out there observing nature. Then the sounds started. Not bears, not owls, not coyotes. Something else. What they recorded over those nights wasn't just noise, it had rhythm, structure, a strange, almost unsettling sense of intention. There were patterns that sounded like call and response, tones that rose and fell with consistency, long flowing vocal sequences that didn't match anything in any field guide for North American wildlife. Those recordings would later become known as the Sierra Sounds, and they've been debated ever since. Years later, the audio landed in the hands of Scott Nelson, a retired U.S. Navy specialist trained in analyzing communication systems. This wasn't a hobbyist. This was someone whose job was to break down signals, human or otherwise, and figure out whether they carried meaning. He listened, studied, broke it down. And his conclusion? What he was hearing showed the hallmarks of structured language, not random animal calls, not instinct-driven noise, but something with syntax, repetition that felt intentional, phonetic variation that suggested communication. In his words, something was talking. Now, let's be clear, because this matters. Nelson's conclusion hasn't been validated by mainstream linguistics or published in widely accepted peer-reviewed journals. No major scientific body has signed off on it. And in science, that matters. A lot. But here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't just some guy guessing. This is a trained expert, applying the same analytical tools he used professionally, looking at real data, and arriving at a conclusion that doesn't fit neatly into the "it's just animals" box. That doesn't make him right, but it does make the conversation harder to dismiss. And the Sierra Sounds aren't the only piece of this puzzle. Across decades, field researchers and witnesses from the Pacific Northwest all the way to the Appalachians have reported vocalizations that don't behave like normal animal sounds. Deep, echoing whoops, chest-thumping rhythms, and in some cases, something that sounds eerily like mimicry of human speech. Not perfect, not clear, but close enough to raise eyebrows. In the animal world, that kind of vocal complexity is rare. You're talking about species like chimpanzees, dolphins, even certain birds like crows. Creatures capable of more than instinct, capable of pattern, adaptation, maybe even intention. So where does that leave this? Because then things get even stranger. According to accounts shared with David Paulides by members of the Hoopa tribe, there's something that doesn't fit into biology at all. Not sound, not movement, but communication that doesn't happen out loud. Telepathy. Multiple witnesses described encounters where no words were spoken, but the message was clear: leave, now. A sudden, overwhelming sense of being watched and understood, like something was communicating intent directly, without sound or gesture. Outside of paranormal circles, experiences like that are usually written off as psychological. Stress, fear, the brain trying to make sense of the unknown. And maybe that's all it is. But here's what makes it harder to ignore: the consistency. Different people, different moments, same description, same feeling. No collaboration, no shared script. At the very least, it's a pattern. And patterns, real ones, tend to lead somewhere, which raises the next question. If this is all just stories, why do some of the most credible witnesses to these encounters happen to wear government-issued uniforms? The government cover-up nobody wants to talk about. Buckle in, because this is where the story starts, walking a very fine line between what's documented and what's seriously debated. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, tools literally anyone can use to access government records, David Paulides and his team have uncovered official documents referencing encounters with large, unidentified bipedal creatures on federal land. We're not talking random internet posts. These are reports with letterheads, file numbers, and agency names attached, national park logs, ranger notes, even military reports. The paper trail is real. What it actually proves? That's where things get complicated. One of the more talked about cases involves a reported sighting at the Nevada test site, a highly restricted desert facility tied to U.S. nuclear testing. According to a government-related release, a security guard claimed to have seen a large, hairy, upright creature cross a road in broad daylight back in 1980. No forest, no cover, just open desert and tight security. It's the kind of setting that makes the sighting feel even stranger. Paulides points to cases like this to argue these creatures aren't limited to deep woods, and that witnesses inside government systems may be discouraged from speaking openly. But here's the other side, and it matters. Wildlife experts and researchers say sightings like these aren't uncommon on federal land. Under stress, low light, or isolation, the human brain fills in gaps. Bears stand upright, shadows stretch. People misidentify what they see. And the biggest issue remains: there's still no verified body. No bones, no DNA confirmed across multiple independent labs. For mainstream science, that absence is everything. Paulides flips that argument. He says the lack of physical evidence is suspicious, especially considering how many large animals die in remote areas without ever being found. It's not a clean debate. Nature erases traces faster than most people realize. So the real question lingers. What happens the day undeniable proof finally shows up? And who's actually ready for that? American Sasquatch, the 2025 bombshell that changed everything. Fast forward to December 1, 2025. After nearly 3 years of work behind the scenes, David Paulides drops what might be the most ambitious project of his entire career. American Sasquatch, Man, Myth, or Monster. It's a full-length documentary directed by Gabe Torres, the same mind behind Unsolved Mysteries, a guy who knows how to walk the tightrope between mystery and credibility without turning everything into a circus. And right away, you can tell, this isn't your typical shaky camera Bigfoot content. No cheap jump scares, no over-the-top music, trying to force tension where there is none. This feels different. It's polished, controlled, almost cautious, like everyone involved knew exactly how easy it would be to get laughed out of the room and went out of their way to avoid that. The film pulls together the biggest threads of Paulides' life's work and lays them out like a case file. You've got Harvey Pratt and his eerily consistent witness sketches, Scott Nelson breaking down the Sierra sounds and arguing they resemble structured language. There are detailed track-cast comparisons, side-by-side analyses, and testimonies from multiple native communities, not just the Hoopa, but other tribes who've lived alongside this mystery for generations without trying to turn it into entertainment. And then the film takes a turn, because layered on top of all that grounded, boots-on-the-ground investigation is something new, something a little more uncomfortable. The documentary introduces the idea, carefully but unmistakably, of using quantum physics as a possible framework to explain what traditional biology can't. Now, let's be clear. No mainstream physicist has published peer-reviewed work linking quantum mechanics to Bigfoot behavior. This isn't settled science, not even close. What it is a sign. A sign that the people closest to this data feel like they've hit a wall. That certain patterns, like tracks that vanish mid-stride or sightings where something appears and disappears without a trace, don't fit neatly into any known model. So the question becomes, is this bold, forward-thinking curiosity? Or is this the exact moment where a serious investigation starts slipping into something unfalsifiable? That line is thin, and the film knows it. Then there's the political angle. The documentary features Tim Burchett, an actual sitting U.S. representative who's been vocal about transparency when it comes to unexplained phenomena. His presence isn't played for shock value. It's subtle, but it matters, because it reflects something bigger happening in the background. Ever since the recent UFO hearings in the U.S., topics that used to live on the fringe are slowly creeping into more serious conversations. Does Bigfoot get pulled along in that shift? Maybe. Maybe not. But having someone like Burchett even entertain the discussion publicly, that's new. Critics, predictably, stayed skeptical. That was never going to change overnight. But audiences? They reacted differently. A lot of viewers didn't see a sensationalized story. They saw something measured, thoughtful, built on decades of fieldwork by someone trained to evaluate evidence, not just tell stories. And that's really the core of it. Because in Paulides' world, after the books, the documentaries, the FOIA requests, the interviews, and countless hours in the field, the conclusion hasn't changed. Not everything holds up. Not every claim survives scrutiny. But taken together, he argues the pattern is too consistent, too widespread, and too persistent to dismiss as one long-running hoax. According to him, it points to something real, something that exists just outside the boundaries of what institutions are comfortable confirming. And if that confirmation ever does come, if the full truth actually lands, it's probably not going to be neat or simple or easy for anyone to accept. So here's where it lands. Something that might be part human, something producing sounds that trained linguists won't dismiss as just animal noise, something leaving behind tracks that even experts hesitate to call fake. And somehow it keeps popping up in official records, from remote Nevada reports to national park logs. Make of that what you will. David Paulides isn't begging you to believe him, never has. He's asking you to sit with the evidence and the discomfort of not having a clean answer. If this cracks something open in your mind, hit subscribe, because what's coming next makes this feel small. So tell me, is Bigfoot real, or is this the most disciplined story ever told?